history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man, Communism and the Bolshevik Revolution, a Historical Analysis. Introduction, The Shadow of Red. Welcome back to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. Tonight, we delve into a subject that has cast a long and undeniable shadow across 20th century history, shaping nations, igniting ideological fires, and fundamentally altering the course of human history. Communism and the Bolshevik Revolution. There's a certain inevitability, perhaps, or a cyclical quality to the grand narratives of human progress and regress. A few narratives are as potent and as fraught with both utopian promise and chilling reality as the story of the Red Star's ascent. It's a tale that often gets simplified, reduced to caricatures and sound bites, but like the intricate dance of smoke and ash from a well-lit cigarette, the truth is often far more complex, nuanced, and frankly, more interesting. We're not just talking about abstract political theories here. We're talking about the raw, visceral forces that can topple empires, the seductive power of radical ideas when millions are suffering, and the immense, often terrible human cost of attempting to engineer a perfect society. From the hushed whispers in smoky backrooms to the thunderous pronouncements from revolutionary platforms, this is a story that grips the imagination and demands our attention. The Bolshevik Revolution wasn't a spontaneous eruption. It was a culmination of deep-seated socio-political maladies, a desperate gamble in a nation teetering on the brink. It was a moment when the old world cracked and something new, something entirely unprecedented, clawed its way into existence. And understanding how that happened, how a relatively small faction could seize the reins of such a vast and turbulent empire, is crucial to understanding the world we inhabit today. We'll be exploring the fertile ground of Tsarist Russia, the intellectual currents of Marxism and Leninism, the pivotal moments of that fateful year, and the seismic aftermath that would reshape global geopolitics for decades to come. It's a journey through ideology, power, and the enduring, often contradictory nature of human aspiration. Now, before we plunge headfirst into the heart of this revolution, a brief pause. We'll be taking a short break shortly to hear from our sponsors who help keep these musings flowing. Stick around. We've got some compelling products to discuss that resonate with the spirit of preparedness and quality that and I suspect many of you, appreciate. Welcome back to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. We've set the stage, introduced the grand, sweeping narrative of communism and the Bolshevik Revolution. But before we can understand the explosion, we must first understand the conditions that created the powder keg. Tonight, we journey back to Tsarist Russia, a vast, sprawling empire on the precipice of unimaginable change. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing decay, a society burdened by centuries of tradition, inequality, and mounting pressure. Imagine Russia at the turn of the 20th century. It was a land of stark contrasts. On one hand, you had the glittering opulence of the imperial court, the landed aristocracy living lives of unfathomable privilege, detached from the realities faced by the vast majority. On the other hand, you had a nation of peasants, over 80% of the population, living in conditions that frankly hadn't much changed since the serfs were officially emancipated in 1861. And even that emancipation was a deeply flawed affair, leaving the peasants land poor, burdened by redemption payments, and trapped in a cycle of debt and hardship. The autocracy of the Tsar was the bedrock of this stratified society. Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, ruled with an iron fist, or at least he tried to. His authority was considered divinely ordained, absolute. There was no real parliament with any meaningful power, no robust system of checks and balances. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed by the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. Any whisper of opposition could land you in a Siberian labor camp, or worse. This stifling political atmosphere bred a deep-seated resentment, a frustration that had nowhere to go but underground, festering in the hearts of those who dreamed of a different Russia. The double-edged sword of industrialization. Then came industrialization, a force that, while promising progress, only served to exacerbate existing tensions. Russia, eager to catch up with the West, embarked on a rapid state-sponsored industrialization drive, particularly in the 1890s. This meant that growth of factories, primarily in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, but this wasn't the organic, gradual industrial revolution seen in places like Britain. It was a sudden jolt, a rapid influx of peasants seeking work, creating a new urban working class, the proletariat, that lived and toiled in appalling conditions. These factory workers faced grueling hours, minuscule wages, dangerous workplaces, and squalid living conditions in overcrowded urban slums. They were a concentrated mass of discontent, susceptible to radical ideas. Unlike the dispersed peasantry, these workers could congregate, share grievances, and organize. The very forces that were meant to modernize Russia were, in fact, creating the breeding ground for revolution. The peasantry, though largely agrarian, was not immune to these pressures. Famines were recurrent. Population growth outstripped the land available. The mir, the traditional village commune, often hindered agricultural innovation and individual initiative. The promises of the 1861 emancipation had soured into a bitter reality. They yearned for land, for relief from taxes and conscription, for a life free from the arbitrary demands of landlords and the state. The chasm between rich and poor. The vast chasm between the impoverished masses and the opulent elite was a constant visible irritant. The aristocracy, the clergy, and the burgeoning industrial class, they all benefited from a system that seemed designed to keep the majority in perpetual subjugation. The Tsar and his family lived in unimaginable luxury, while ordinary Russians struggled for basic survival. This stark inequality wasn't just an economic issue, it was a moral outrage, a deeply felt injustice that fueled the desire for radical change. Adding to this volatile mix was the intellectual ferment of the time. Dissatisfaction breeds ideas, and Russia was awash in them. Marxism, with its analysis of class struggle and its promises of a workers' paradise, found fertile ground among the educated intelligentsia and the increasingly organized urban workers. But Russian revolutionaries weren't simply copy pasting European theories, they adapted them to their unique contexts. The rise of the revolutionary ideologies. Two main currents emerged within the Marxist movement itself: the Bolsheviks, meaning majority, and the Mensheviks, meaning minority, led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks advocated for a disciplined professional party of revolutionaries to lead the proletariat, believing that the revolution would need to be spearheaded by a vanguard acting on behalf of the masses. The Mensheviks, on the other hand, envisioned a broader based party and believed that Russia needed to go through a full capitalist stage before a socialist revolution could occur. Beyond the Marxist factions, you had the Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, who drew more heavily on the traditions of the peasantry. They believed Russia could bypass capitalism and move directly to socialism through the peasant communes. While often more agrarian focused, the SRs were also a significant force. Their commitment to political terror as a means of change showed the lengths to which revolutionaries were willing to go. Other groups, like the liberal cadets, constitutional Democrats, advocated for a constitutional monarchy and democratic reforms, but their influence was often limited by the Tsar's intransigence and the more radical allure of socialist ideologies to the masses. The Tsar's government, rather than addressing these grievances, often responded with repression or ineffective reforms. The Dumas, or parliaments, that were eventually introduced after the 1905 revolution, had their powers severely curtailed. Each attempt at reform seemed to fall short, further alienating large segments of the population. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, exposed the incompetence of the Tsarist regime and led to the revolution of 1905, a bloody Sunday and widespread strikes that forced concessions, including the establishment of the Duma. But these concessions were largely rolled back, leaving the underlying problems untouched. By the time World War I erupted in 1914, Russia was a society simmering with discontent. The war effort, with its massive casualties, economic strain, and the Tsar's personal command of the army, a move that left the government in the hands of unpopular Tsarina and the mystic Rasputin, proved to be the final fatal catalyst. The fragile crust of Tsarist authority, already weakened by internal pressures, the poverty of the peasants, the misery of the workers, the intellectual disaffection, the autocratic rule, was about to be shattered by the brutal realities of total war. These were the smoldering embers, the deep-seated grievances, and the ideological currents that would soon ignite the conflagration of 1917. We'll explore how these conditions directly paved the way for the Bolsheviks to seize power in our next segment. The Spark, February and October Revolutions. Welcome back to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. We've established the volatile landscape of Tsarist Russia, a nation groaning under the weight of autocracy, inequality, and the strains of a disastrous war. Now we turn to the events of 1917, the year that would see the Romanov dynasty crumble and the Bolsheviks rise from the ashes of the old order. The year began with Russia still embroiled in World War I. The conflict had bled the nation dry, both in terms of human lives and economic resources. The war exposed the Tsarist regime's profound incompetence and corruption. Soldiers were poorly equipped, poorly led, and morale was abysmal. On the home front, food shortages were rampant, inflation crippled the economy, and the common people bore the brunt of the suffering. By February 1917, the simmering discontent reached a boiling point. The February Revolution, the Tsar's abdication. The spark ignited in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, the capital. On February 23, 1917, or March 8th by the Gregorian calendar used in the West, International Women's Day protests began. Women, primarily factory workers, took to the streets demanding bread and an end to war. These protests quickly escalated. Soon hundreds of thousands of workers joined them, their cries echoing throughout the city. The situation devolved from protests to riots, and the authorities found themselves unable to contain the unrest. The crucial turning point came when the soldiers garrisoned at Petrograd, many of whom were sympathetic to the demonstrators or had their own grievances, refused to fire on the crowd. Instead, many began to mutiny and to join the revolutionaries. This loss of military support was catastrophic for Tsar Nicholas II. His authority, already eroded, evaporated completely. Facing widespread rebellion, the Duma, the Tsarist parliament, pressured the Tsar to abdicate. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II, realizing his position was untenable, signed the instrument of abdication, formally ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. The Tsar and his family were subsequently placed under house arrest. The Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet. In the vacuum left by the Tsar's abdication, two bodies emerged to fill the power void. The first was the Provisional Government, formed by members of the Duma. It was intended to be a temporary liberal administration, tasked with governing Russia until a new democratically elected constituent assembly could be convened to decide the nation's future. Its early leaders, like Prince Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, were largely moderate politicians. The second, arguably more influential in the long run, was the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This was a council of elected representatives from the factories and the military units in the capital. It mirrored councils that had sprung up during the 1905 revolution. The Soviet, dominated by socialist parties, quickly gained considerable power, particularly over the military and essential services. This created a situation of dual power, where the provisional government had the outward forms of authority, but the Petrograd Soviet held the real leverage on the ground. The provisional government made a critical error. It decided to continue Russia's involvement in World War I. This was deeply unpopular with the soldiers and the populace, who craved peace. Furthermore, it failed to address the burning issues of land redistribution and economic hardship. The situation remained precarious, with the country still at war, starving and deeply divided. Lenin's return and the Bolshevik strategy. Into this chaotic environment stepped Vladimir Lenin. Having been in exile in Switzerland, he was able to return to Russia in April 1917, thanks to assistance from the German government, who hoped his presence would destabilize Russia and take it out of the war. Upon his arrival at the Finland station in Petrograd, Lenin immediately galvanized the Bolshevik Party. He issued the famous April Thesis, a radical blueprint for revolution. Lenin rejected any cooperation with the provisional government and called for an immediate transfer of all power to the Soviets. His core message was encapsulated in three potent, universally appealing slogans: peace, land, and bread. Peace. This promised an end to the unpopular and ruinous World War I, a direct appeal to the war-weary soldiers and citizens. Land. This addressed the peasants' most pressing desire, the redistribution of land from the nobility and large landowners to those who actually worked it. Bread. This spoke to the dire economic conditions, the rampant inflation and the severe food shortages plaguing the cities. These slogans were incredibly effective because they resonated with the deepest needs and desires of the majority of the Russian population. While other parties debated and procrastinated, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's charismatic and decisive leadership, offered clear, radical solutions. The period between February and October was marked by a growing Bolshevik influence. The provisional government's failures, particularly its continued prosecution of the war and its inability to solve the economic crisis, led to increasing disillusionment. Events like the July Days, a spontaneous uprising in Petrograd that was ultimately suppressed, failed to dislodge the provisional government, but demonstrated the growing radicalization of the masses and the increasing support for the Bolsheviks. The October Revolution, the seizure of power. By autumn, the situation was ripe for another upheaval. The Bolsheviks had gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet and in other key Soviets across the country. The provisional government, now led by Alexander Kerensky, was weakened, isolated, and increasingly seen as illegitimate. In the early hours of October 25, 1917, November 7th by the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks launched their meticulously planned seizure of power. Under the direction of Leon Trotsky, who had organized the Bolshevik military apparatus, the Red Guards, armed factory workers, moved swiftly and efficiently. They took control of key strategic points in Petrograd: railway stations, post offices, telegraph centers, bridges, and banks. The operation was remarkably bloodless in its initial stages. The Bolsheviks met little organized resistance. The provisional government's forces were minimal and largely ineffective. The climax of the takeover involved the storming of the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. While often portrayed in dramatic, almost epic terms, the storming of the Winter Palace was more of an occupation than a violent assault. The Red Guards breached the palace after minimal resistance, arresting the ministers of the provisional government. Kerensky himself had already fled the city. That same day, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convened. Lenin appeared before the delegates and triumphantly announced the overthrow of the provisional government and the transfer of power to the Soviets. The Congress adopted decrees on peace, immediately calling for an end for the war, and on land, abolishing private ownership and distributing land to the peasants. This was the dawn of Soviet power. The October Revolution, in contrast to the widespread social uprising of February, was a more calculated, decisive coup d'etat orchestrated by a disciplined political party. It was swift, relatively efficient, and demonstrated the Bolsheviks' organizational capacity and their ability to exploit the weaknesses of their opponents. They had promised peace, land, and bread, and in the chaos of 1917, those promises, however illusory they might prove to be in the long run, were enough to win them the day. The Bolshevik seizure of power marked a radical departure, a point of no return in Russian history. The old order was gone. replaced by a regime that would fundamentally attempt to reshape society according to Marxist-Leninist principles. But this was just the beginning. The true test of the Bolsheviks' power and the subsequent struggle to consolidate it would unfold in the brutal years of the Russian Civil War, a topic we will explore next. Alright, before we dive deeper into the tumultuous aftermath of the revolution, I want to take a moment to talk about something that fuels these late night musings, and I suspect many of yours as well, a damn good cup of coffee. We're talking about Black Rifle Coffee Company. This isn't your average brew. This is coffee with a mission. Founded by veterans, Black Rifle Coffee is all about serving up high quality roasted to perfection coffee that fuels the American spirit. Whether you're gearing up for a long day, gearing down after a tough one, or just need that clear-headed focus to tackle whatever comes your way, they've got a blend for you. You know the drill. I'm talking about rich, bold flavors that stand up for themselves, like Freedom Roast, or the smooth intensity of the AK-47 espresso. It's coffee that understands the value of hard work, the importance of sharp thinking, and the unapologetic celebration of freedom. It's about quality you can taste, from beans sourced with care to a company that stands behind its principles and its patrons. So if you're tired of the bland and bureaucratic, if you appreciate a coffee that's as robust and dependable as the people who drink it, then head over to blackriflecoffee.com. Check out their roasts, their gear, and join a community that's all about living life with a little more edge, a lot more flavor, and a whole lot of patriotism. Black Rifle Coffee, brewed for those who demand more. Consolidating power, the early Bolshevik state. Welcome back to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's decisive leadership, had seized power in Petrograd in October of 1917. It was a swift, almost surgical strike, a dramatic conclusion to a tumultuous year. But capturing power is one thing, holding on to it, and more importantly, reshaping a vast war-torn nation according to revolutionary ideals, was an entirely different and infinitely more perilous undertaking. The immediate aftermath of the October Revolution was not a period of triumphant consolidation, but a frantic, often brutal struggle to establish the legitimacy and authority of the new Bolshevik state amidst overwhelming challenges. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, a blow to democracy. One of the first major tests of the Bolsheviks' commitment to democratic principles, or perhaps their willingness to discard them when inconvenient, came when the Constituent Assembly, elections for this body, intended to create a new constitutional framework for Russia, had been promised by the provisional government and were widely anticipated as the legitimate expression of the popular will. The Bolsheviks themselves had initially championed these elections. However, when the results came in early 1918, they were not in the Bolsheviks' favor. The socialist revolutionaries, SRs, particularly their peasant-based faction, won a clear majority. While the Bolsheviks secured only about 24% of the seats, the Constituent Assembly convened on January 5th, 1918, but it was clear that the Bolsheviks had no intention of relinquishing power or allowing a non-Bolshevik government to form. After just one day of contentious debate, during which the Bolshevik delegates walked out, the assembly was forcibly dissolved by armed Red Guards. The justification offered was that the Constituent Assembly represented an outdated bourgeois democratic phase, and that the Soviets were the true organs of revolutionary power. This act, however, was widely condemned as a betrayal of revolutionary promises and a stark indication of the authoritarian direction the new regime was taking. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, peace at price. Lenin's promise of peace, land, and bread was immediately put to the test by the ongoing devastating World War I. The Bolsheviks' primary aim was to extricate Russia from the conflict, allowing them to focus on internal consolidation. Negotiation with Central Powers began, but they were fraught with difficulty. The terms demanded by Germany were harsh, reflecting Russia's weakened position. Despite fierce opposition within the Bolshevik Party, particularly from the left communists, who argued for a revolutionary war against the imperialist powers, Lenin pushed for an acceptance of the treaty. He famously argued that the survival of the revolution in Russia was paramount, even if it meant making humiliating territorial concessions. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on March 3, 1918. Its terms were catastrophic for Russia. It ceded vast territories, including Ukraine, Finland, and Baltic provinces. and Poland to German control. Russia lost significant industrial areas, agricultural heartlands, and nearly a third of its population. It was a peace born of desperation, a capitulation that satisfied Lenin's immediate need to end the war, but deeply angered the nationalist elements in many former allies, contributing significantly to the outbreak of the Russian Civil War. The establishment of the Cheka, the Red Terror begins. As internal opposition grew and the seeds of civil war were sown, the Bolsheviks moved swiftly to create instruments of political control and repression. On December 20th, 1917, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, better known as the Cheka, was established. Headed by the fearsome Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka was granted sweeping powers to arrest, interrogate, and execute suspected enemies of the revolution without due process. Initially presented as a temporary measure to deal with immediate threats, the Cheka quickly became the Bolsheviks' primary tool for enforcing their will and eliminating dissent. It operated outside the normal legal framework, acting as both a secret police and revolutionary tribunal. The period of the Red Terror, officially proclaimed in September 1918, following assassination attempts on Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders, saw widespread arrests, executions, and the establishment of concentration camps. The Cheka's efficiency in suppressing opposition, however brutal, was instrumental in the Bolsheviks' ability to maintain control in the face of widespread internal and external threats. Initial decrees transforming society. Beyond political control, the Bolsheviks immediately set about implementing decrees aimed at fundamentally transforming Russian society according to their socialist vision. Decree on Land, November 1917. This decree abolished private ownership of land and transferred all estates, church lands, and crown lands to committees of peasants. It legitimized the widespread land seizures that had already been occurring and aimed to satisfy the demands of the peasantry, securing their support or at least neutrality for the Bolshevik regime. Decree on Workers' Control, November 1917. This gave workers the right to oversee the management of factories and businesses, ostensibly transferring economic power to the proletariat. In practice, it often led to chaotic management, declining production, and disputes between workers and newly appointed Bolshevik administrators. Decree on Peace, October 1917. As mentioned, this called for an immediate end to the war and negotiations for a democratic peace without annexations or indemnities. Separation of Church and State, January 1918. This decree nationalized all church property and officially separated the Orthodox Church from the state, ending its privileged position and beginning a long period of intense religious persecution. These early decrees signaled a radical break from Russia's past and laid the groundwork for the sweeping changes that would define the Soviet Union. However, they also generated immense opposition. The land redistribution alienated landlords, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly alienated liberals and moderate socialists, and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk fueled resentment and provided ammunition for anti-Bolshevik forces. Challenges faced by the new regime. The Bolsheviks inherited a nation in ruins. Their grip on power was tenuous, extending effectively only to the major cities. The vastness of Russia, coupled with the breakdown of transportation and communication networks, made centralized control incredibly difficult. They faced internal opposition. Monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, Mensheviks, and SRs, and nationalist groups all opposed Bolshevik rule. Foreign intervention. Allied powers, Britain, France, the US, Japan, intervened militarily, ostensibly to protect their interests and reopen the Eastern Front against Germany, but also to support anti-Bolshevik forces. Economic collapse. The war, coupled with the chaos of revolution and the early Bolshevik economic policies, had devastated the economy. Food shortages, hyperinflation, and industrial decline were rampant. Logistical nightmares. Governing such a vast territory with crippled infrastructure was a monumental task. The period immediately following the October Revolution was a desperate scramble for survival for the Bolsheviks. They had seized the levers of power, but the real challenge, winning the Civil War, rebuilding the economy, and forging a new society, had only just begun. The Russian Civil War. Reds versus Whites. Welcome back to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. We've charted the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, a seemingly decisive moment that promised a new dawn for Russia. But as any seasoned observer knows, the end of one conflict is merely the prelude to another, more brutal one. The Bolsheviks, now the ruling party, found themselves not the masters of a unified nation, but the leaders of a country fracturing under the weight of internal dissent and external pressures. The period that followed was one of the most savage and destructive in Russian history, the Russian Civil War, a brutal, bloody struggle that pitted revolutionary fervor against a desperate coalition of counter-revolutionaries, and ultimately forged the Soviet state in a crucible of fire and blood. The Bolsheviks' October Revolution was, in essence, a coup in the capital. Their authority beyond Petrograd and Moscow was far from absolute. The harsh realities of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded vast territories and resources to Germany, alienated many and provided a rallying cry of opposition. The dissolution of the democratically elected Constituent Assembly in January 1918 further deepened the divide, confirming the fears of those who saw the Bolsheviks as dictatorial usurpers. The opposing forces, Reds, Whites, and others. The conflict that erupted was complex, involving multiple factions, but it primarily coalesced into a struggle between the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, and the diverse anti-Bolshevik forces, collectively termed the Whites. The Reds, led by the Bolshevik Party under Lenin and Trotsky, their core strength lay in the centralized organization, the control of the industrial heartlands, and the creation of a formidable Red Army. Initially cobbled together from Red Guards and sympathetic soldiers, the Red Army was transformed by Trotsky into a disciplined fighting force. He implemented conscription, utilizing former Tsarist officers, often under the watchful eye of the political commissars, and imposed strict military discipline. Their ideology was communism, aiming for a worldwide socialist revolution and the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat. The Whites. This was not a monolithic entity, but a disparate coalition united by opposition to Bolshevism. They included monarchists and conservatives, those who wished to restore the Romanov dynasty or a similar autocratic system, liberals and moderate socialists, those who had supported the February Revolution and opposed the Bolshevik coup, seeking a democratic republic or a socialist government operating within parliamentary norms. Nationalists, various groups seeking independence for regions that had been part of the Russian Empire, such as Ukrainians, Georgians, and Poles. Military leaders, figures like Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia, General Anton Denikin in the south, and General Nikolai Yudenich in the northwest, who commanded significant anti-Bolshevik armies. The Whites lacked a unified political program or a single charismatic leader. Their military efforts were often uncoordinated, hampered by internal rivalries and a failure to appeal effectively to the peasantry or the working class. Many white armies were also notorious for their brutality and anti-Semitic pogroms, which alienated potential supporters. Other factions. The Civil War also saw the rise of numerous other groups. The Greens were peasant armies, often fighting against both Reds and Whites to protect their villages and interests, sometimes supporting one side against the other, depending on local circumstances. Nationalist movements in various regions, like Ukraine, the Baltics, and the Caucasus, fought for independence from Russian control, adding further complexity to the conflict. Foreign intervention. Adding to another layer of the complexity and intervention was the involvement of foreign powers. The Allied nations, Britain, France, the United States, Japan, and others, were deeply concerned about the Bolsheviks' withdrawal from World War I and their radical ideology, which they feared could spread globally. They sent troops and provided financial and material aid to the White armies, hoping to either topple the Bolshevik regime or at least establish an Eastern Front against Germany. Intervention took various forms. British forces landed in the north to secure strategic ports. French troops were present in Odessa. Japanese forces occupied parts of Siberia, and American troops were stationed in Archangel and Vladivostok. While the scale and effectiveness of this intervention are debated by historians, it certainly prolonged the conflict, fueled the Bolshevik propaganda about defending Russia against foreign invaders, and deepened the interventionist distrust of the new Soviet regime. War communism, the economy of survival. To fuel the war effort and manage the collapsing economy, the Bolsheviks implemented a series of drastic economic and political measures known as war communism. Introduced in mid-1918, it was a harsh, centralized system designed to ensure the Red Army and cities received essential supplies, even at immense human cost. Grain requisitioning. This was perhaps the most infamous aspect. Armed detachments were sent to the countryside to forcibly confiscate surplus grain, and often more than surplus, from the peasantry to feed the army and urban populations. This policy, while necessary for survival, led to widespread peasant uprisings, reduced agricultural output, contributed to devastating famines, most notably the Volga famine of 1921. Nationalization of industry. All major industries were brought under state control, with a strong emphasis on military production. Private enterprise was severely curtailed or eliminated. Labor mobilization. Compulsory labor was introduced, and workers could be moved between factories as the state saw fit. Strikes were forbidden. Rationing and abolition of money. Efforts were made to distribute goods through a state controlled rationing system, and there were attempts to move towards a moneyless economy, though money continued to circulate in practice. War communism was a brutal necessity for the Bolsheviks, enabling them to win the Civil War by prioritizing military needs. However, it created immense hardship for the population, particularly the peasantry, and severely damaged the economy, leading to widespread discontent and rebellion, such as the Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921. The Red Terror and the White Terror. The Russian Civil War was characterized by extreme brutality on all sides. The Bolsheviks, through Cheka, implemented the Red Terror, a systematic campaign of repression aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. Executions, often summary, were carried out against former czarist officials, aristocrats, bourgeois, members of rival political parties, and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Hostages were taken and executed to deter opposition and retaliate against assassinations or uprisings. Conversely, the White Armies were also responsible for horrific atrocities. Their campaigns were often marked by anti-Semitic pogroms, massacres of peasants suspected of supporting the Reds, and the brutal suppression of any dissent. The lack of a unified command and political ideology among the whites contributed to a more chaotic, though no less deadly form of terror. The mutual violence and repression created a cycle of revenge, deeply scarring the nation. The course of the war and Bolshevik victory. The Civil War raged from roughly 1918 to 1922, fought across the vast expanse of the former Russian Empire. Initially, the White Army, particularly those led by Denikin and Kolchak, achieved significant successes, pushing towards Moscow. However, the Bolsheviks' strategic advantages began to tell. The Red Army, under Trotsky's dynamic leadership, became a more cohesive and effective force. The Bolsheviks continued to control the central heartland, allowing them to move troops and supplies more rapidly than the dispersed white forces. They also benefited from a more unified political command and a clearer, albeit ruthless, ideology that motivated many supporters. By late 1919 and early 1920, the major white offensives that had been defeated. Kolchak was captured and executed in Siberia in early 1920, and Denikin's forces were pushed back to Crimea, where they were eventually evacuated. Udinich's army was defeated near Petrograd, while fighting continued in the Far East and against nationalist movements for a few more years. The decisive phase of the Civil War had ended with the Bolshevik victory. The human cost. The human cost of the Russian Civil War was fucking staggering. Estimates vary, but it was believed that between 7 and 12 million people died as a direct result of the conflict. Through combat, disease, starvation, and widespread political terror, millions more were displaced, becoming refugees within Russia or fleeing abroad. The war devastated the nation's infrastructure, crippled its economy, and left a legacy of bitterness and trauma that would shape Soviet society for decades to come. The victory of the Reds had been secured, but it came at a terrible price, hardening the Bolshevik regime and entrenching the methods of repression that would come to be hallmarks of the Soviet state. In this line of work, chronicling chronicling the grand, often brutal sweep of history, certain tools become indispensable. It's not always about the grand pronouncements or sweeping movements. It's also about the quiet moments of observation, the meticulous capture of fleeting thoughts, the planning that goes into shaping events. For precisely these reasons, I find myself consistently drawn to the simple, enduring utility of a moleskin notebook. There's a timelessness to them, isn't there? A certain weight and quality that speaks of purpose. They're not flashy, they don't demand attention, but they are profoundly reliable. Whether you're sketching out a strategic map, jotting down the critical nuances of political theory, or simply reporting the observations that might spark the next great idea, a moleskin is a perfect companion. Its pages are ready to receive your thoughts, its binding sturdy enough to withstand the rigmarole of a life lived in motion. In the age of ephemeral digital notes and fleeting online thoughts, there's something deeply satisfying, something grounding about the tangible act of writing. It forces a different kind of engagement, a more deliberate process. Moleskine understands this. They've created a product that respects the act of thinking itself. For those who appreciate the value of a well-kept record, that of giving ideas form and permanence, look no further. Find a moleskin and start capturing your own history. War, Communism, and the NEP Economic Experiments. Welcome back to the Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. We've navigated the tumultuous seas of revolution and civil war, witnessing the Bolsheviks consolidate their power through a combination of ideology, ruthlessness, and sheer will. But the immense struggle had left Russia not just politically transformed, but economically shattered. The promises of peace, land, and bread had been overshadowed by the grim realities of conflict, and the radical measures implemented to survive that conflict had plunged the nation into even deeper crisis. Now we turn our attention to the Bolsheviks' attempts to rebuild, to forge a new economic order from the ashes. Their two starkly contrasting policies, war, communism, and the new economic policy. War, communism, the economy of necessity. As the Bolsheviks fought for survival during the Civil War, roughly 1918 to 1921, they implemented a series of drastic economic measures known collectively as war communism. This was not a preordained ideological blueprint for a socialist economy, but rather a pragmatic, albeit brutal, response to the exigencies of war. The primary goal was to supply the Red Army and the urban centers with essential goods, even if it meant sacrificing economic rationality and inflicting immense suffering on the population, particularly the peasantry. Key pillars of war communism include grain requisitioning. This was the most infamous and devastating policy. Armed detachments, often from urban factory committees of the Cheka, were dispatched to the countryside to forcibly confiscate surplus grain, and frequently much more than surplus, from the peasants. This justification was that the state needed to provision the army with in the starving cities. This policy, however, engendered widespread resentment, peasant uprisings, and a drastic reduction in agricultural production, as peasants saw little incentive to grow more than they needed for their own survival. Nationalization of industry. All major industries were brought under state control. Private ownership and management were largely abolished. While intended to centralize production and direct it towards the war effort, this often led to inefficiency, mismanagement, and a decline in output due to lack of expertise and incentive. Labor mobilization. Compulsory labor was introduced, particularly for former bourgeois and the conscripted. Workers could be assigned to specific factories or tasks, and strikes were strictly forbidden. Centralized distribution and rationing. Efforts were made to eliminate private trade and establish a system of state-controlled rationing for essential goods. Money itself began to lose value due to hyperinflation, and there were attempts to move towards a moneyless economy based on direct exchange with labor vouchers. The ideological justification for war communism was that it was a necessary transitional phase towards a fully socialist economy, a powerful lever to crush the bourgeois and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, the practical consequences were dire. Industrial output plummeted. Agricultural production fell dramatically due to peasant resistance and the requisitioning of policies. By 1921, industrial production was estimated to be only about 20% of its 1913 levels. Hyperinflation was rampant, and the breakdown of distribution systems led to widespread famine, most notably the catastrophic Volga famine of 1921 to 22, which claimed the lives of millions. The Kronstadt Rebellion and the turning point. The deep discontent fueled by war communism manifested in numerous peasant revolts and worker strikes. The most symbolic of these was the Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921. Sailors and soldiers at the naval base of Kronstadt, who had been among the earliest and most ardent supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution, rose up demanding Soviets without Bolsheviks, free speech, and an end to requisitioning, and the right to trade freely. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed with immense bloodshed by the Red Army, sent shockwaves through the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin recognized that the policies of war communism had alienated crucial segments of the population, particularly the peasantry, and threatened the very survival of the regime. The new economic policy, NEP, pragmatism replaces ideology. In response to the widespread crisis in the Kronstadt uprising, Lenin made a significant strategic pivot. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, he introduced the new economic policy, NEP. This was a pragmatic, even temporary, concession to capitalist methods designed to revive the economy and pacify the population, particularly the peasantry. The NEP represented partial retreat from the radicalism of war communism. Key features of the NEP included abolition of grain requisitioning. The forced confiscation of grain was replaced by a fixed tax in kind. Peasants were required to pay a certain amount of their produce to the state, but they were allowed to keep and sell any surplus on the open market. This restored the incentive for agricultural production. Revival of private trade. Private enterprise, small-scale production, and free trade were permitted again. Shops reopened, and markets flourished, particularly in the cities. This led to the emergence of a new class of traders and entrepreneurs, often referred to as NEP men. Denationalization. Small and medium-sized industries were denationalized, leased out to private individuals or cooperatives. Key strategic industries, such as heavy industry, banking, and foreign trade, remained under state control. The commanding heights. Monetary reform. The government introduced a more stable currency, the chevronnets, backed by gold, which helped to stabilize the economy and facilitate trade. The NEP proved remarkably successful in stabilizing the country and fostering economic recovery. Agricultural output increased significantly, and the widespread famine was largely overcome. By 1926, agricultural production had reached pre-war levels, trade revived, and industrial production began to climb, although it still lagged behind pre-war levels in some sectors. The NEP brought to a degree of economic stability and eased social tensions, allowing the Bolshevik regime to consolidate its power more firmly. Ideological debates and the future of the revolution. The introduction of the NEP sparked intense ideological debates within the Communist Party. Many hardline communists, particularly the left communists, who had championed war communism, viewed the NEP as a betrayal of socialist principles, a dangerous concession to capitalism that threatened to undermine the revolution. They feared the resurgence of the bourgeois and the erosion of proletarian power. Lenin, however, defended the NEP as a necessary strategic retreat, a breathing space that allowed socialism to be built on a more solid foundation. He argued that Russia was too backwards and devastated to immediately implement a full socialist economy, and that it was essential to win over the peasantry and rebuild the productive forces before attempting more radical measures. He famously described the NEP as a form of state capitalism, where the state retained control of the commanding heights while allowing capitalist mechanisms to operate at the lower levels. The NEP created a precarious balance. While it brought economic recovery, it also generated social tensions, with the perceived prosperity of the NEP men contrasting sharply with the continued austerity faced by many workers and the ideological discomfort of many party members. The NEP would ultimately be a temporary measure phased out by Stalin in the late 1920s with the implementation of forced collectivization and rapid industrialization, but its success in navigating the immediate post-war chaos demonstrated a crucial capacity for pragmatic adaptation within the Bolshevik leadership, even as it exposed the inherent contradictions in building a socialist economy. Legacy and ideological impact. We've traversed the tumultuous path from decaying czarist autocracy through the fiery crucible of revolution and civil war, witnessed the birth of the Soviet state. But the story doesn't end with the Red Army's victory or implementation of the new economic policy. The Bolshevik Revolution was not merely an event confined to Russia's vast borders. It was a seismic shockwave that reverberated across the globe, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape and shaping the intellectual and political currents of the 20th century. Its legacy is complex, often contradictory, a tapestry woven with threads of both utopian aspiration and brutal authoritarianism. The formation of the Soviet Union, a new global power. Following the Civil War, the Bolsheviks formally established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, in December of 1922. This was the culmination of Lenin's vision for a federation of socialist republics, though in practice it became a highly centralized, one-party state dominated by the Communist Party headquartered in Moscow. The USSR emerged as a colossal, ideologically driven superpower, a stark contrast to the capitalist West. Its very existence challenged the established international order and presented a competing model of governance and economic organization. The nation, battered by war and revolution, began the arduous task of reconstruction, laying the foundations for an industrial and military behemoth that would define global politics for the next 70 years. The global spread of communism, an ideological contagion. Perhaps the most profound immediate impact of the Bolshevik Revolution was the dramatic boost it gave to communist movements worldwide. Lenin and the Bolsheviks believed their revolution was not just an isolated event, but the vanguard of the global proletarian uprising. They established the Communist International, Comintern, in 1919, an organization dedicated to promoting and coordinating communist revolutions internationally. The success in Russia inspired socialist intellectuals and workers in other countries, fueling revolutionary movements and socialist parties across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The allure of communism lay in its promise of radical equality and an end to exploitation, and the solution that perceived injustices of capitalism, particularly in the wake of World War I and the Great Depression. While many communist movements failed to achieve power or were brutally suppressed, the existence of the Soviet Union provided a powerful ideological anchor and at times material support for these movements. This ideological competition became a defining feature of the 20th century, leading to proxy conflicts, political maneuvering, and a pervasive sense of global ideological struggle. The Cold War, a bipolar world. The ideological chasm between the Soviet Union and the capitalist West, primarily the United States, eventually solidified into the Cold War. This decades-long standoff, characterized by geopolitical tension, an arms race, including nuclear proliferation, proxy wars, and intense propaganda, was a direct outgrowth of the competing visions of society ushered in by the Bolshevik Revolution. The world became largely divided into two spheres of influence, each vying for global dominance and attempting to export its respective ideology. The fear of communist expansion, fueled by the Soviet Union's growing military might and its support for revolutionary movements, deeply influenced Western foreign policy, leading to interventions, alliances, and a constant state of high alert. The ideal versus the reality, a cynical reflection. Looking back, the gap between revolutionary ideals and the lived reality under Bolshevik rule is stark, almost tragically so. The initial promises of liberation, equality, and a workers' paradise often dissolve into the grim realities of totalitarian control, state-sponsored terror, and economic mismanagement. The dictatorship of the proletariat, envisioned as a temporary phase of true democracy for the masses, morphed into the absolute dictatorship of the Communist Party, and ultimately of a single leader. The revolution that promised to abolish oppression created new, arguably more pervasive forms of it. The meticulous planning, the ideological purity, the unwavering belief in the historical inevitability of communism, all these elements were, while fascinating from an intellectual standpoint, failed to account for the complexities of human nature, the resilience of individual liberty, and the practicalities of governing a vast diverse nation. We saw the dismantling of democratic institutions like the Constituent Assembly, the brutal suppression of dissent through the Cheka and its successors, and the immense human cost of policies like war communism and the forced collectivization that followed. Millions perished, if not in the brief, decisive struggle for power, but in the subsequent consolidation of that power and the attempts to engineer a socialist society from the top down. The ideals of peace, land, and bread often gave way to internal conflict, state control of agriculture, and a different kind of breadline. Enduring impact on global history. Bolshevik Revolution's impact extends far beyond the Cold War. It inspired decolonization movements in Asia and Africa, with newly independent nations often adopting socialist or Marxist-Leninist models for development, seeing the Soviet Union as an alternative to Western imperialism. It fundamentally altered the discourse and political economy, forcing capitalist nations to confront issues of social welfare, workers' rights, and the economic inequality to prevent the spread of communist ideas. The very concept of revolution as a means to achieve radical societal transformation was redefined and amplified by the Bolshevik experience. The techniques of party organization, propaganda, and state control pioneered by the Bolsheviks would be studied, emulated, and adapted by political movements and regimes all across the globe, for better or worse, even in its eventual collapse in 1991. The Soviet Union's legacy continues to shape the political map, international relations, and the ongoing debates about the nature of power, ideology, and the perennial human quest for a better society. A quest that, as the Bolsheviks demonstrated, can lead down paths both noble and profoundly terrifying. We've discussed revolutions, seismic shifts, and the shape nations. These are grand, often messy affairs, but underpinning all good endeavors, the signing of treaties, the drafting of constitutions, are the tools we use. And when it comes to consequence, few more dependable, more precisely engineered than the pen's product produced by skillcraft. These aren't just writing instruments, they are implements of authority, designed for official use, for documents that matter. You see them in the hands of those who operate within corridors of power, those who draft legislation, sign mandates, and record history. There's a reason for that reliability. When you pick up a skillcraft pen, you're holding a testament to precision engineering, durability, and a lineage tied to the very functioning of government. Think about it. In the midst of upheaval, in the quiet moments of deliberation, clarity and precision are paramount. A pen that performs flawlessly, that delivers a consistent, unwavering line. It's more than just convenience. It's an essential partner in the act of creation and governance. Skillcraft understands this. They craft pens built to last, designed for the gravitas of the task at hand. For those who appreciate tools that embody both purpose and authority, look to Skillcraft for the pens that get the important work done. Conclusion echoes in the smoke. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the rise of communism and the Bolshevik Revolution. We've seen how the crumbling edifice of Tsarist Russia, burdened by inequality, autocracy, and the strains of war, became the fertile ground for radical ideas. We've examined the potent blend of Marxist theory and Leninist pragmatism that fueled the Bolshevik machine, adapting ideology to the harsh realities of a vast, troubled empire. We've traced the sparks of February and the decisive fire of October 1917, the swift seizure of power that promised a new world order. We witnessed the brutal consolidation of power, the crucible of the Civil War, the desperate measures of war communism, and the strategic retreat of the new economic policy. We've seen how this single revolution sent shockwaves across the globe, igniting ideological conflicts that would define much of the 20th century, setting in motion forces that continue to shape our world today. The Bolshevik Revolution stands as a stark, often chilling testament to the transformative power of ideas, the volatility of political systems, and the enduring human desire for change. It's a narrative woven with threads of utopian aspiration and profound authoritarianism, of liberation and immense suffering. The echoes of 1917, the promises of equality, the specter of total state control, the seductive allure of radical solutions to complex problems, continue to reverberate through the smoke of history. Power, as we've seen, is a mercurial thing. It can be seized and it can be wielded, but it rarely conforms perfectly to the blueprints drawn up by its architects. The desire to engineer a perfect society, to eradicate all forms of oppression, can paradoxically lead to the creation of new and often more insidious forms of control. The lessons learned, but perhaps ignored, from this era are as relevant now as they were a century ago. So, as the embers of this discussion cool, consider the enduring legacy, consider the cyclical nature of power, the persistent temptation of utopian ideas. the critical importance of examining the historical currents that shape our present. Until next time, keep your wit sharp and your perspectives clear. I'm the cigarette smoking man. We're gonna win.